Hello, everybody. This is Darren back again. So we're going to have another Monday with Mark here, week 2. Today we're going to look at verses 2 and 3. So last week we did verse 1, talked about how you have this good news announcement set up and all the meaning behind that. In particular, we talked about the way that the good news that Mark will relate first challenges the Roman Empire and its conception of peace and prosperity and salvation or the good life, and then also the way that you can kind of see glimpses of how Mark's story will also challenge the nationalist vision of some of the Jewish leadership at the time. Some of that vision was important in challenging the Roman narrative, but at the same time led to some exclusionary ways of thinking and things that would have been detrimental to Mark's community to stay with that. So those two narratives we'll see get picked up again in these next two verses as well. What I want to start with is this recognition that I was reading about this week, about how these prologues of the beginnings of ancient writing, how important and how careful people would often construct that first little bit of their writing, mostly because a lot of it was spoken and relayed orally, and there was not a lot of access to to other to books and things like that. You had to be pretty serious about getting access to that sort of thing. What I want to do is just take a debated back and forth about doing this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Just share the first 15 verses of Mark's gospel in this kind of way that I have it set up here on this paper. I don't know how easily you can see that or not, but let's hope that you can see it okay. You can see that at the top there you have the first 3 verses beginning with the good news of Jesus Christ, and then going to these next 2 verses that says, as is written in the prophet Isaiah, "See, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight." And then, I don't know how clear it is, but you can see what I tried to show. The rest of the prologue is split into these 2 parts, one part about John and one part about Jesus, with some parallels there. And what I want to just highlight is that you can see that the prologue begins with the good news and ends with the good news. And then the word wilderness will appear 4 times in here. We'll talk a little bit more about wilderness a little bit later. Just wanted to give you a kind of see how carefully, with these repeated words and ideas, how carefully Mark has constructed this text. So what I want to talk about within that are three W's: war, wilderness, and the way. And the war is the one that is not specifically mentioned in the text, so I'll start with that. We didn't talk too much about the setting, the most likely setting for the Gospel of Mark last week, but most everyone would agree that it is set sometime around the the years 66 and on, during the Jewish revolt that would lead to the Roman army coming into Jerusalem and destroying the temple, all but what's left of it now, and causing, a real crisis in the Jewish faith, which what we have to be clear about is that anyone within the church, anyone that's being addressed by something in the New Testament were people of the Jewish faith in one way or another at that time. Even if they were Gentiles coming in, there was nothing what you could call Christianity at the time. They were Jewish followers of Jesus. So this was going to be a crisis for everyone. And there's a debate back and forth about whether Mark is written before or after that, cataclysmic event of the destruction of the temple. But what's important to know is that the war, revolt, revolution, all these kind of, everything that comes to your mind when you think about that was happening on the ground for real in Galilee and in Israel and in Judea, the whole area. And so most people think that Mark is writing to a community that is trying to come to terms with this, trying to figure out where they should be, where they should stand, what side they should be on. And, it's a serious thing whenever the world you're living in is in a place where you're being called to take sides. So this is the background of a war, of prolonged skirmishes going on during the time of Mark's writing and within his community. And so they need to figure out what to do about it. And what's interesting is you have these hearkenings back at the beginning of Mark's letter, his gospel, to some kind of key phrases from the Jewish Hebrew scriptures that evoke all of these images in people's minds, because they were kind of iconic moments in the past. So we'll take a look at those. If you start with let's start with a general idea that you have. If you were somewhere where the lectionary was read this past week, that we read Isaiah 40, which is quoted in verse 3. Isaiah 40 verse 3 is quoted in Mark 1 verse 3, and we also read Mark 1 through 8 for the lectionary this week as well. But that vision in Isaiah 40 is this vision of Yahweh coming and declaring to the people who are in exile, the first time that the temple is destroyed and Jerusalem is sacked, the first time people are exiled, Isaiah is coming to pronounce that exile is over, and it pronounces, "Comfort, O comfort my people," at the beginning of that Isaiah 40 text, a key turn declaring that God is about to do something new, the beginning of some new good news. And you can see if you look in Isaiah 40 verses 9 and 10, it talks about glad tidings and good news in that verse as well. This idea that God is coming and will be present with the people, and there's this good news. And that's part of what is part of what Mark is hearkening back to, this idea that the situation you're in, the situation you're in right now with Roman oppression and terrible situation with taxation and military occupation and all of these things, that there's this glimmer of hope that God is doing this new thing again, like we talked about with the beginning of the good news in verse 1. That's the Isaiah text in Mark verse 1, verse 3. But I have to admit that Mark plays a bit of a dangerous game with some of with the other quote that a lot of people think that there's a combination of Exodus 23:20 and Malachi 3:1 that happens in chapter 1, verse 2. And I say it's a dangerous, kind of a dangerous game, is because Mark evokes this text from Exodus 23 that comes at the point where the people are in the wilderness. They've been freed from Egypt, and now it's time to turn their attention toward the promised land. And in Exodus 23 and verse 20 and following, God kind of lays out there how God will go before the people, and if they, are faithful to the covenant, basically, God. The dangerous thing, I think, is that in that text, God is basically saying that God will wipe out the people who are in the land for the sake of these folks who've just been liberated from Egypt. And so clearly, evoking that memory, those ideas, at a time when people are ready to rise up and revolt and take up arms against the people in their land who they don't think belong there, is a dangerous kind of imagination to put out to his community. So that's I think that's a bit of a risky one. But I think what we'll see later when we talk about the way that's being cleared and the way that Jesus will take up is a critique and an adjustment of that vision that is laid out in Exodus. So within both the Exodus text and the Isaiah text that is quoted, you have a vision of God making a way for the people through the wilderness and toward the promised land, in Isaiah, out of exile, and presumably returning to Jerusalem and to Israel again for a renewed kingdom. But in the middle of that, in verse 2, after the Exodus quote, you have this quote from Malachi 3, and this brings in a very interesting element into this whole mix, because in Malachi, what's happening is this is after the people have returned from exile, after the Isaiah story, and it's looking at what was promised there, the good news that was given, and where it's at now. Where does it stand on the ground? Where do we see it? And right before the text that's quoted about the messenger being sent to prepare the way, in Malachi, you have the people asking, where is the God of justice? They feel like they're being that they're being persecuted, that those who do evil are getting away with it, and they're wondering, where is this God who brings comfort? Where is this God whose mighty hand will come and save us? And Malachi will return the answer that yes, there is this one who's preparing the way, this one who is preparing the way of the Lord. But the part of the problem is that the people themselves have caused the situation that they're in. They're the ones that have caused the harm to the people. And they will talk about, Malachi will talk about issues within the temple, how the main base of the Jewish people of the time, how it is, later on in Malachi 3, we'll talk about how it's become, he doesn't use the words exactly den of robbers, but echoes later on, whenever Jesus clears the temple, there's clear echoes in Malachi 3, 10 or 8 through 10, about how the temple itself has become a place of robbery. There is clear critique of the people and the priesthood. And what's interesting about this, I think, is that you have this war and this revolt going on. You have a community trying to figure out what's the best way to go forward. And you have these two kind of, within this short couple verses, you have these layers of possibility that are going to give us this little peek inside who Jesus is going to be. And one of them is this idea that Jesus is the one who, when we are in our exile, when we are in our wilderness, when we are in a place where we don't know how to go forward, we can't figure out what to do, the Lord is going to open a path. Jesus is going to walk that path, and echoing what in the Old Testament is kind of this divine warrior idea, is going to do battle with the evil and all that's holding us back from what God desires for the world. And on one side, you can take that. You could take that from Mark's community's point of view, and from our point of view, you can pick out the people that you don't like, that are, the oppressive ones, and say, well, God's going to get rid of those people, and then everything's going to be okay. But the Malachi text in the middle there also says, well, we as the people who think that we hold the truth or the wisdom or the true religion and think that we're in the right place, and are calling out to God to act. Sometimes when God shows up, it's to judge us as well as the people who we think need to be judged. And I think this will, this is clear in Jesus, in the narrative about Jesus in Mark. And I think it's important, it's important for us as we, wherever we're at right now, trying to figure out our pathway forward. There's always the, whatever community we find ourselves in, whatever community we think we belong to, there's always, those outside of the community that we think need to be judged. But this text will say yes, there are things about the way that the world's system is set up that needs to be judged and needs to be changed and needs to be confronted, and will be confronted by Jesus. And then also, though, there are ways within ourselves that we need to check the communities that we're a part of. We need to check the harm that we are doing to each other within our own communities as well. And so, in the context, just to close this out, in the context of war and choosing sides, part of what the narrative is going to, part about what Jesus' story is going to say is that you have to be careful when you call for God to be on your side in a revolt or in some kind of battle, because when you're calling for God to intervene, basically, God's judgments are going to be true and righteous, and if you fall on the wrong side of that, you'll be judged just as much as the people you're calling God to help out in that situation. So, and I think that goes back to the two different narratives we were talking about last week. Very similar ideas. There's the kind of radical nationalism that is promoting, if we can just kick out the Romans, if we can just kick out, the people who are getting in the way of us being the true people of God, the true nation, then we'll be okay. But then there's the clear need to liberate ourselves from the oppressive structures over the top of that. But that's not always an easy line to draw, except for that Mark will say you can find the path to follow by reading this gospel and by looking at how Jesus navigates this situation. And then, then the next thing about that takes us straight to this this word, the way, because you'll see that pops up twice in the beginning of this text. You have, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. So one thing that I think is interesting, if you remember the way that I'll show it real quickly again. You don't need to see the text itself, but you can see how this verse 1 and verse 2 and 3 are set up here. What one commentator says about that is that those verses 2 and 3 kind of take place off the stage. It's almost as if you hear God speaking to Jesus, saying, see, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. And so there's kind of this moment right at the beginning where you have this sense that before the action starts, before John or Jesus comes on the stage, you have this, if you can imagine it in a theater type setting, it's almost like this voice is booming these words to Jesus off the stage, and then John comes on, and what you notice there is that the two different mentions of the way, which come from, that pull together this Malachi text with this Isaiah text that we just talked about, and the kind of all the juicy stuff that's mixed up in that, but also kind of it unites the way of the Lord with the way that Jesus will walk, or the way that Jesus will be and live in the world. It kind of it doesn't make them the same thing, but it shows how they're intimately connected, and that will be important going forward, because these two lines of kind of how you navigate the world, you know, the kind of looking at the danger, I guess, of kind of identifying the people who need to be eliminated or kicked aside, and the kind of other side of this kind of vision of God, coming down and clearing a path in its kind of least attractive way of being articulated, can be a very almost genocidal way of looking at things. And so what becomes key is the way that this word, the way, and Jesus is, and the way it'll be used by Mark, the way it takes the kind of easy the easy way of reading that as God being on our side and coming in and taking care of everybody else. The way that gets turned, especially when we get to chapters 8 through 10, the way that way gets so closely associated with Jesus' willingness to serve, to lift up the least, and to condemn kind of like the way that oppressive systems lorded over the people that they have under their thumb. The way that will be shown as the way that Jesus walks, but also will become more closely tied with the way that the Lord will ask us to walk in the world. You can see later on in the text. And so this, in the context of war, in the context of revolt and revolution all around, you'll see that Jesus comes first in the sense of what Malachi is talking about, calling to account those who theoretically should know what the way things should be operating and the way things should be going. So there are people who have been exposed to some truth and wisdom about the way the world works, in some revelation, even maybe about how God is calling them to be in the world, but they're falling short of that. They're missing the mark, and Jesus will take them to task on that, the way that Malachi does that in his text. And then you'll also see that all the kind of positive and hopeful comfort and salvation and liberation that gets mixed in with the Exodus and the Isaiah texts, we'll see Jesus bringing that about through this cross-shaped way in the world. And that both of those sides are important, and you can see that Mark has masterfully brought all of that together in these first couple of verses. And so the last thing about this is this idea of wilderness. And this is as I showed before, it comes up 4 times in this opening 15 verses or so. And if you read the Isaiah text and the Mark text in church yesterday, or if you heard those read, those being out there in the wilderness, those texts in particular offer this kind of almost hopeful vision of what the wilderness is. In Isaiah, you have the people kind of already in this wilderness, already in this exile. And what you have there is this promise that God meets them there and prepares this way for them into this new thing that God is doing. And John, picking up on this idea, finds himself out in the wilderness with this role of being a voice and an agent of God preparing a new way from the wilderness. And in particular, balancing that off with the Malachi text again, you have what Ched Myers talks about is you have the one verse from Malachi critiquing and talking about the corruption of the temple, of the elite system, of the center of the society, the corruption there, and that if you're seeking for some wisdom and some truth and something that can challenge that centralized power and that system of oppression that's happening there, you have to be out in the wilderness, and the wilderness is often the place where the people who've been kind of ground down by the elite and the central system and the people who the owners and all of these things, you find those people in what the text calls the wilderness. And I think this is something that also, again, through the text, you'll see that Jesus will go again and again to this, this metaphorical or real wilderness space, the space outside of the centers of power, to heal, to teach, to interact with the people there. And it's only kind of at the second half of the book when Jesus has to go and challenge the temple and all that's associated with that, that he will go from the periphery to the center. So that it's interesting that there's that dimension of the wilderness in this. It's a space. It's a space that needs to be. It's a space that needs to be reclaimed, redeemed. It needs healing from the harm that's been done. It needs all of these things, but that doesn't necessarily make it a terrible and dangerous place, according to the gospel, because quite frankly, the most dangerous place is is the temple and the government that will kill Jesus. and also kills John before that. Now, we'll have to look in a couple weeks about Jesus being driven into the wilderness to be tempted, which will offer kind of a different nuance on that, and we can talk about that, or I can talk about it, and anyone who's out there can listen to me talk about it. But I won't assume that there's a we necessarily. But this is something that I think reading this week about these two texts, and particularly about the Isaiah text, and the way, even the way that Malachi picks it up, the kind of in the Exodus story, in the wilderness there, there's always this kind of shadow of judgment hanging over that, and of course, in Exodus 23, right after this kind of agreement is made, where God will, God makes these promises about preparing a way and leading them through the wilderness and taking them into the promised land. It's right after that Moses goes up on the mountain to get the tablets and to learn about how to construct the tabernacle. And of course, we know that when he comes down, the people have built the golden calf, and have immediately turned away from the promises that were made in this, or the offer. They have turned away from the offer that God made them in the 23rd chapter. And so that sense of wilderness is still kind of there, but this the wilderness that really gets highlighted by beginning with saying that everything that this is the prophet Isaiah, and then ending with Isaiah 43 in this opening 2 or 3 verses, and calling it gospel, really highlights an element of wilderness that is starting to push some of that judgment and shadow side, I guess, a scary side of the wilderness away to some degree, to say that look, God is present in this wilderness, and that a way is being prepared right now. A way is being constructed already. There's work going on that God is doing to construct this way through this place, through to the next thing that God is doing, through into what will become, called the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of God throughout the text. So these first 3 verses spent almost an hour and a half talking about the first 3 verses, but there's a lot there. There's a lot there for us, especially trying to come to terms with the difficult times that we're in, especially when there is so much that needs to be judged in the light of the way that Jesus lived and died. There's something that Mark is trying to say in this text that kind of hits on all sides of our understanding of how we deal with ourselves, our communities of faith, and also the broader community, how we should live into that and live into what God is preparing and constructing around us. That I hope, as we keep going through, we can begin to see that more and more clearly, how this this way is being made, and how it has been made, and how it's, it's always returning again and again, to us trying to find a way to understand it. So that's all I wanted to talk about this week, really. Next week we will jump into talking about John, the baptizer, or the baptism of John. I think that we can get through verse 8. I really want to. I think next week I really want to bring in some other texts from maybe W.E.B. Du Bois, the way he compares John in the gospel to John Brown, and maybe we can use that to talk about some of these themes of war and the wilderness and the way, and how John fits into that, and how Du Bois sees John Brown fitting into that as well. So that'll be next week. Thank you all for hanging out. See you then.